There is a fruit growing on the side of American highways right now that contains more vitamin C than 7 oranges combined. Not twice as much, not 5 times as much, 40 times more. A single handful outperforms an entire bag of Florida oranges. It also contains a compound so powerful it outperforms painkillers in clinical trials. For 4,000 years, every major civilization used it as medicine. Then in the 1930s, the United States government told Americans to plant it everywhere. By the 1960s, they reversed course. They classified it as a noxious weed. They sprayed it with Roundup. They made it illegal to sell in multiple states. And the $3 billion citrus industry never said a word. What they did not tell you is that this fruit once saved an entire nation from collapse during the deadliest war in human history, and the science proving its superiority has never been refuted. This is the Rosehip, and this is the story of how America declared war on one of the most nutritious foods ever documented. The rosehip does not look like a superfood. It is a small, round, reddish-orange fruit about the size of a marble that forms at the base of a rose flower after the petals fall away. It grows on thorny bushes in ditches, along fence lines, and at the edges of forests. And its relationship with humans stretches back to the earliest recorded civilizations. By 2600 BC, the ancient Sumerians were cultivating roses not for decoration, but for the small crimson fruit. The Egyptians and Mayans extracted oils from the hips to heal wounds and restore damaged skin, treatments so effective that rosehip oil became known as the elixir of youth. In 600 BC, the Greek poet Sappho studied the rose so closely she named it the Queen of Flowers, a title it still carries today. But it was the Romans who understood the rosehip better than anyone. Pliny the Elder, one of history's most meticulous natural historians, documented dozens of preparations using rosehips to treat stomach ailments, respiratory infections, toothaches, and even the bites of rabid dogs. The Romans were so convinced rosehips could cure rabies that they named the plant Rosa canina, meaning dog rose, a scientific name that has survived for 2,000 years. Across the Pacific, the story was identical. Traditional Chinese doctors prescribed rosehip preparations to improve circulation, reduce fatigue, and restore vitality. Native American tribes across North America relied on rosehips as a critical winter food source when no other fruit could survive the freeze, drying and storing them in quantities large enough to sustain entire communities. They ate them fresh off the bush, ground them into soups, and mixed them into pemmican to fuel hunting parties through months of frozen wilderness. Early Christians carved the first rosary beads from dried rosehips, placing the fruit at the centre of their most sacred devotional practice. In medieval Europe, the berries were believed to carry protective and even magical properties, woven into amulets to ward off illness. This was not a novelty ingredient on the margins of human history. This was a cornerstone of survival medicine on every inhabited continent, used by civilizations that never made contact with one another, all arriving independently at the same conclusion. The rosehip was essential. The modern science confirming what ancient cultures already knew is staggering. Fresh rosehips contain between 500 and 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 grams depending on the species. An orange delivers 53. That is not a marginal difference. That is not a rounding error. That is a factor of 40. Nutritional category of its own. But the vitamin C is only the beginning, and it is not even the most remarkable part. Rosehips contain lycopene and beta-carotene, the same antioxidant compounds that make tomatoes valuable but in higher concentrations. They contain vitamin A for vision repair and immune function, vitamin E for cellular protection, vitamin K for bone density and cardiovascular regulation. A suite of minerals including calcium, magnesium, iron and zinc. They contain omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, compounds typically associated with expensive fish oil supplements that promote heart health and reduce systemic inflammation. What makes rosehip truly extraordinary is the synergy between its vitamin C and its naturally occurring cofactors. The flavonoids, carotenoids, and polyphenols enhance absorption and antioxidant performance far beyond what any synthetic supplement can replicate. Unlike a vitamin C tablet manufactured in a factory, the Rosehip delivers its nutrients in the exact biological packaging that the human body evolved to absorb. And then there is the compound that the pharmaceutical industry does not want to discuss. In 2008, researchers at Frederiksberg University Hospital in Copenhagen published a meta-analysis of 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials involving 287 patients with osteoarthritis of the hip and knee. The patients who received 5 grams of rosehip powder daily experienced statistically significant reductions in pain. They were more than twice as likely to report meaningful improvement compared to patients on placebo. They used fewer painkillers. Their mobility improved. The active compound responsible was identified as a galactolipid called GOPO, found naturally in rosehip seeds and fruit. It inhibits the migration of white blood cells into inflamed tissue, directly reducing the inflammatory cascade that drives joint destruction. Subsequent laboratory studies revealed that this compound can switch off genes responsible for producing enzymes that damage joints and switch on genes that help produce collagen and cartilage. It does not merely mask pain, it addresses the mechanism of the disease itself. A comparison of pain relief effect sizes showed that GOPO outperformed both paracetamol and glucosamine, the 2 most commonly purchased supplements for joint health. In one trial, 8 out of 10 patients reported significant pain reduction within 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 weeks. A naturally occurring compound in a fruit that grows wild on roadsides was demonstrably outperforming the standard pharmaceutical interventions for one of the most common chronic conditions on Earth. So why is this fruit not in every grocery store in America? Why is it not on every breakfast table, in every school lunch program, in every hospital recovery ward? Why is it classified as a noxious weed in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, West Virginia, Iowa, and a dozen other states? The answer begins in the 1930s, when the United States Department of Agriculture Soil Conservation Service launched a nationwide campaign encouraging Americans to plant multiflora rose. This is a prolific rosehip-producing species native to East Asia, and the government wanted it along highways, farm boundaries, and eroded hillsides. They promoted it as a living fence, a crash barrier for highway medians to reduce headlight glare and stop out-of-control vehicles, and a habitat enhancement for wildlife including quail, pheasant, and cottontail rabbit. State conservation departments distributed free plants and provided planting instructions. By the millions, Americans put rosehip-bearing rosebushes into the ground at their own government's direction. The plant did exactly what it was designed to do. It grew, it spread, it thrived in poor soil, harsh winters, and full sun, produced enormous quantities of fruit that fed birds, small mammals, and for the few who still remembered, human beings. Then something shifted. By the 1960s, the same conservationists who had encouraged planting began sounding alarms. The plant was too successful. It was spreading into pastures, forest edges, and unmanaged land. It was outcompeting native vegetation. And it was doing something else that nobody in the agricultural establishment wanted to acknowledge. It was producing a free, perennial, self-sustaining source of the most vitamin C-dense fruit in the Northern Hemisphere, in a country whose citrus and supplement industries depended entirely on the premise that Americans needed to buy their vitamin C. The reclassification happened fast. State after state designated multiflora rose a noxious weed. Massachusetts banned its propagation and sale outright. The government published control bulletins recommending chemical eradication using glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, along with triclopyr, dicamba, and phosamine. County extension offices distributed detailed instructions for foliar spraying, basal bark treatment, and cut stump herbicide application. Landowners were told to spray from both sides of rose hedgerows for maximum chemical penetration. They were told to repeat treatments across multiple growing seasons until every plant was dead. Millions of rosehip-bearing plants were systematically poisoned across the eastern half of the United States. The official justification was ecological. The plant was invasive. It crowded out native species. It created thorny thickets that gave cattle infectious wounds. All of that was true. But the timing tells a different story. The same decades that saw the eradication of wild rosehip bushes across America saw the explosive growth of the industries that had everything to lose from a free alternative. The global vitamin C market, now valued at over $2 billion annually, depends almost entirely on synthetic ascorbic acid manufactured in industrial facilities. 94% of the world's commercial vitamin C comes from production in China. The American consumer pays for pills, powders, gummies, effervescent tablets, and fortified juices to replace a nutrient that once grew wild outside their kitchen window. The citrus industry, worth nearly $3 billion in the United States alone, and supporting over 32,000 jobs in Florida, has spent decades positioning the orange as the singular icon of vitamin C. Every glass of morning orange juice, every commercial, every immunity-boosting label in the supplement aisle reinforces a narrative that requires Americans to believe there is no better, cheaper, more accessible source. There is. It was growing on the highway median, on the farm fence, in the abandoned lot at the end of the block, and they sprayed it with herbicide. The cruelest irony is that we already know what happens when a nation takes rosehips seriously, because one of the most powerful countries on Earth already ran the experiment under the most extreme conditions imaginable. In 1941, with German submarines blockading shipping lanes and citrus imports reduced to almost nothing, the British population was sliding toward widespread vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy, a disease the modern world thought it had eradicated, was a genuine threat to an island nation at war. The Ministry of Health did not turn to pharmaceutical companies. It did not commission a synthetic supplement program. It looked at its own hedgerows and found the answer that had been growing there for centuries. The ministry launched a national rosehip collection campaign, the largest organised foraging effort in British history. School children were given days off to gather wild rosehips from country lanes and hedgerows across England, Scotland and Wales. Boy Scouts, Girl Guides and the Women's Institute organised mass harvests in every county. Collectors were paid for every 14 pounds of hips they brought in. The response was extraordinary. In that first year, Britain collected 200 tons of rosehips, the equivalent of 134 million individual fruits, and processed them into 600,000 bottles of National Rosehip syrup. The syrup was sold through chemist shops at subsidised prices and given free to children under 5. 1 teaspoon a day provided half a child's daily vitamin C requirement. A child who tried the syrup for the first time described it simply as lovely, like sweeties. The programme was so successful that the following year, the ministry called for 1,500 to 2,000 tonnes. Counties competed against each other for collection totals. Grandmothers who survived the Blitz would remember the taste of that syrup for the rest of their lives. A nation under siege, cut off from global supply chains, its cities burning under aerial bombardment, fed its children and preserved its public health using a fruit that grew wild in every hedgerow in the country. Britain did not need Florida. It did not need synthetic supplements. It did not need a $2 billion industry to tell it where vitamin C came from. It needed the plant that had been growing in its own backyard for thousands of years. That knowledge has not disappeared. It has simply been pushed to the margins. Across Scandinavia, Rosehip's soup remains a traditional staple served in schools and hospitals. In Chile, rosehip jam is a household standard found in kitchens from Santiago to Patagonia. In Germany and Austria, rosehip tea outsells most herbal varieties and lines pharmacy shelves alongside conventional cold remedies. Clinical researchers in Denmark continue publishing peer-reviewed studies on rosehip compounds and their applications for arthritis, inflammation, and cardiovascular health. The science is not contested. The history is not disputed. The nutritional data has been replicated across laboratories on 3 continents. What has changed is access. In the country that once told its citizens to plant rosehip bushes from coast to coast, the same plant is now classified as a pest, targeted with chemical herbicides, and functionally erased from the American food vocabulary. You can walk into any grocery store in the United States and find 17 varieties of orange juice, synthetic vitamin C tablets in 4 different flavours, and collagen supplements marketed at $40 a bottle. You will not find a single fresh rosehip. You will not find rosehip syrup in the pharmacy aisle where it belongs. You will not find a government recommendation to harvest the fruit that contains 40 times the vitamin C of the product they spent billions convincing you to buy instead. But the Rosehip does not care about marketing budgets, or noxious weed designations, or the quarterly earnings of citrus conglomerates. It survives. It grows through cracks in abandoned lots, along rural fence lines, at the edges of forests and riverbanks where the herbicide trucks do not reach. It fruits every autumn, producing those bright red and orange hips in clusters along its thorny canes, the same way it has for millennia, waiting for someone to remember what the Sumerians, the Romans, the Chinese, the Native Americans, and the desperate mothers of wartime Britain already knew. You can find Rosehip tea at any health food store tonight. You can order dried Rosehips online and make your own syrup using the same method they used in 1941. You can grow Rosehip bushes in your own backyard and harvest more vitamin C every autumn than a crate of oranges could ever provide. The knowledge survived 4,000 years of empire, war, famine, and deliberate suppression. Now it is yours. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video and make sure to hit subscribe.